Hi, I'm Ms. Collier, and I'm here today with the Tortilla Cat Files. We're going to talk to you today about the Titanic, the Carpathian, and the Californian, which are three ships that were involved in the sinking of the Titanic. But before we get into that, I want to talk to you a little bit about shipping lanes. Back when ships were used for most of the transport before air transport, they had these various shipping lanes. And I brought the globe so you could kind of see. Let's see. We want Europe. We're talking about from England over to New York. And as you can see, and as you know, the world is shaped like this globe. It's a sphere. And this up here was considered the Northern Atlantic Passage. And it's the most dangerous passage because there's a lot of ice, icebergs, ice fields, lots of ice that you can run into in this passage. But the reason, and then there was a Southern Atlantic Passage, which was down here further when you were going from Europe or from America over to Italy or Spain or somewhere in there, which is lower down on the globe. But the reason they would travel this Northern Atlantic Passage, this most dangerous passage, is because of the way the Earth is shaped, like a sphere. And up here from England to New York, it's a lot closer together if you go on this northern route and then come down south and hit New York. So that's why they did this. It saved time, and it was a lot faster. And time for ships was money. So let's talk now about the Titanic first. The captain of the Titanic was a man named Edward Smith. He was a very well-respected captain. He actually was this was his last voyage. He was retiring from the White Star Line, and they had given him this job of being the captain of the maiden voyage, the first voyage of the Titanic. Is kind of like his farewell tour if you were a rock star. This was his last big chance to captain a ship, and this was kind of like his reward before he retired. The Titanic was, at the time she was built, the largest sailing ship ever built. She set sail on April the 10th in 1912 from Southampton, England, made some stops, one in Cherbourg, France, one in what was called Queenstown, Ireland, then is now known as the town of Cobb, Ireland, and then continued on to New York. At the point when she had everybody on that was going to get on, she had 2,207 people, which included the crew and the passengers on board the ship. She sailed for a few days without any big incidents while she was sailing, but on April the 14th, the ship began receiving radio messages, transmissions about ice in the path where she was sailing, in the area where she was sailing. Both icebergs, which are the great big huge floating pieces of ice, and what they call pack ice or ice fields, which is like more flat pieces of ice, but they're floating closer together, and it's kind of like you weave in and out through them. My understanding is ice fields pose less of a problem for these bigger ships, but often in the places where you're going to have an ice field, it's very likely there's going to be icebergs as well. And remember, this is 1912. They didn't have radio where you actually talked from ship to ship. This is Morse code that's tapped out between ship to ship. They didn't have any kind of radar. All they had was guys in the ship, on the ship, either up high or at deck level, at sea level, with binoculars watching for stuff. They didn't have a whole lot of extra lights that they can shine out at them in the night so that they can illuminate the horizon and be able to see icebergs. This is just human error looking for a place to happen. They didn't have any kind of the equipment that ships have today to be able to avoid icebergs. They just had people's eyeballs. At about 11:30 p.m., an iceberg was sighted by the lookout who was up high. It was very close with the point when he sighted it. And he radioed down immediately. The ship immediately began to try to make a turn. This is a huge ship. It takes a long time for it to turn. It began to turn. It didn't hit the iceberg head on, but it brushed against the side of the iceberg. And that caused the ship to open up a 300-foot gash or cut in the side of the ship that was down under the water line. So this is a huge disaster. The Titanic had been built with what they called watertight compartments that were supposed to be able to hold water if the ship hit something and water began coming in. But there was a serious design flaw to these watertight compartments. They didn't have a lid. So the water would fill up one and then run over into the next one and fill up that one and run over into the next one. And it was believed that the ship could sail with at least 4 of these watertight compartments filled, but at least 5 of them were involved in this gash that was opened up in the ship's side, plus the fact that the water just keeps tipping over into the next one, and it's eventually going to fill up all of the watertight compartments. So this is a major problem. The captain sent the ship's carpenter, or he was one of the builders of the ship, his name was Thomas Anderson, down to do what's called sound the ship, which means to see if it's been damaged and how badly. He came back up and said, yeah, dude, this is bad. We're going down. We maybe have 90 minutes. At that point, the captain ordered the wireless operator, the radio operator, to start sending out a distress call, which he did. And interestingly, the Titanic was the first ship to use the SOS call. Before that, ships had used what was called a CQD. CQ means basically all stations. Distress means, or D means distress. So basically this stood for come quick distress. And distress at sea means somebody's going to die, and somebody's going to die fairly quickly if nobody gets help there. At that same time, at about 12 o'clock, midnight, when the ship began sending out its distress calls, Captain Smith ordered the passengers to begin getting into the lifeboats, women and children first, which was the custom. The ship's crew started rolling the lifeboats out. They had to swing them out so that now they're not inside the boat any longer. They've swung out over the ocean so they can load them and then lower them down into the ocean. The ship is beginning to tilt. They call it a list, which is going to create problems as it gets worse. Part of the problem was that people didn't think that this ship could sink. They believed this ship was unsinkable. So why should we get off of this boat and get into these cold little lifeboats and go out there on the ocean and sit for a while, and then we're going to get back on. We're just going to wait. We're just going to wait it out. It was very cold. It was below freezing air temperature. The water temperature was around 29 degrees. So it was hard to get people to get into the lifeboats. The other big problem was that under English law, there was this weird formula that they had to go through to see exactly how many lifeboats a ship had to have. And for the Titanic, it had to have lifeboats enough to carry, where did I write that down? 962 people. And we know there are over 2,000 people on this ship, but they had to have enough lifeboats for 962. And the reason that is because in 1909, there had been a collision between 2 ships, the Republic and the Floridan. And they had crashed in a fog bank. And the Republic was badly damaged and was sinking. She began sending out distress calls. Ships started coming to help. Sorry, Bass is opening cabinets over there. Ships were coming to help. the Floridian had pulled out of the fog bank and discovered that she was not seriously damaged. She came back in and started taking passengers on from the damaged Republic. The Republic stayed afloat for something like 16 hours. It was plenty of time to get everybody off. There were 4 people killed in the original crash when the 2 boats crashed into each other. 4 people died at the point of impact, but none of the passengers were killed. And this was hailed as, isn't this amazing? Radio has allowed this to happen because ships came from all over, and they even could manage to tow the Republic in, and I believe she was repaired. But they thought, we're never going to need to evacuate everybody because now we have radio, and ships are going to stay up because they're built really well, and it's going to take a long time for them to sink. And so we have plenty of time. So we don't need lifeboats for everybody. The Titanic was required to have lifeboats for 962 people, but in fact, she actually had 16 regular boats, which were the ones that just are boats all the time. And she had 4 collapsible boats, which kind of folded up, and then you had to raise the sides and they became boats. So she actually had enough space for 1,178 people. She had more lifeboat space than she was required by law to have, even though she had over 2,200 people on board. So they already knew there was a problem. They start putting people onto these lifeboats. People are reluctant to get on the lifeboats. Some of the lifeboats were launched with, 30 people, and they would hold a lot of people. They could have held up to 1,100 people. While this is going on, the Titanic crew starts noticing over in the distance, somewhere between 5 and 20 miles, it depends on who you talk to, there was another ship that was at anchor and just sitting there. They start sending up rockets, which are kind of like Roman candles. Y'all have seen Roman candles that throw up white stars. This is the classic distress signal. You shoot one, you wait a couple of minutes, you shoot the next one, you wait a couple of minutes, you shoot the next one, you shoot these in a series, so that maybe this ship over there they could see would come and help save some of these people. They never got any kind of a response from this ship, so they finally gave up. The radio operator was radioing, he was radioing, he was radioing. He got a response fairly quickly from a ship called the Carpathian, which we will talk a little bit more about in a minute. The Carpathian said that she was coming as fast as she could get there, but she was about 60 miles away. And based on the weather conditions, the ice, and the fact that she was a smaller ship, she wasn't going to be able to go as fast as the Titanic. It was going to take anywhere from 3 to 4 hours for her to get to the Titanic, but she was coming. They knew that there was a ship coming if they could just stay afloat that long. At 2:20, the Titanic actually sank. By that time, all of the boats had been launched, except for a couple of the collapsible boats. They kind of washed off as the boat went under. The air temperature was, like I said, it was about freezing or less than freezing. The water temperature was about 29 degrees. Thousands of people didn't make it into lifeboats, and they got washed off into the ocean. With the temperature being as low as it was, what's called hypothermia would set in very quickly. So probably within about 10 minutes, the people that had gotten washed off into the ocean were unconscious. And within about 20 minutes, they were dead. If you weren't in a lifeboat, you didn't survive. The lifeboats picked a few people up, but very, very few. Most of the lifeboats had gotten out past where the people were. They were afraid to come back in, because they were afraid that when the large ship sank, it might pull the lifeboats down with it. And they were also afraid that they were going to be swamped by the people who were in the ocean trying to get into the lifeboat, and they would all die. So that's where we are with the Titanic. Now, the Carpathia, her captain's name was Arthur Rostron. The Carpathia was sailing from New York to Italy, so she was sailing on the Southern Atlantic Passage. Her radio operator heard the Titanic's distress call at around midnight. He immediately notified the captain. The captain immediately ordered a course change, then double checked. Are you absolutely sure this is what's going on? The radio operator said he was absolutely sure. And so the captain had the course worked out to get to where the Titanic really was, but he had already ordered the ship to turn in the direction it was going to need to go without wasting any time at all. While they are getting there, he orders the chief engineer, and the Carpathia was a passenger liner also. She had passengers on her ship, but it's really late at night. So he ordered the chief engineer to divert all of the steam, which is how the power was obtained for this ship, taken away from heating the cabins for the passengers, away from heating the water for the passengers, and put all of it into the engines to try to get as much speed as possible. The Carpathia's top speed was supposed to be about 14 knots, which is about 16 miles an hour. In the end, they got her up to 17 knots, which is just under 20 miles an hour. Now think about that. We think about ships as going really fast, but they don't. They don't go really fast compared to our car. We drive more than 20 miles an hour pretty much everywhere we go outside of school zones. 35 or 30 or 35 miles an hour is pretty much the slowest we ever go. We live in Devine. We drive from Devine to San Antonio, which is a little bit less than the distance the Carpathia had to go to get to the Titanic, which was 60 miles. Most places I tend to go in San Antonio is about 45 miles from here, 45, 50 miles. And it takes, not that long to get there. So it's very slow speeds when you think about that, but he was doing the very best he can. While all of this was going on, he had already told, there were 3 doctors on board the Carpathia. He had each doctor set up in a different one of the dining halls for the 3 different classes, first class, second class, and steerage. He had one set for each one of those classes. He had the gangplank doors open. He had them go ahead and swing the lifeboats out so that was ready. He had them put cargo nets over the side of the ship so that if people were in the water or people were in the lifeboats, they could climb up the cargo nets. He had slings that they could throw down and pull up ladies that couldn't climb up because of the way they were dressed, or because ladies didn't exercise a whole lot back then. And bags that they could put some very small children in and pull up in a bag, so they didn't have to climb up these nets, or if maybe they had been injured, they didn't have to climb up. He had the kitchen start making hot soup and hot coffee so that everything was going to be ready when the Carpathia got to the site. They weren't going to have to waste any time at all deciding, hey, we should do this or we should do that. Everything he could think to do, he did. This was going to run like the Chick-fil-A drive-in of ship rescues. And whatever you think about Chick-fil-A, whether you like their chicken or not, they are efficient at that drive-through. Captain Rostron was going to be like that. They arrived where the Titanic had the position the Titanic had given them at about 3:30 a.m. Now, this is a little over an hour after the Titanic had already sunk. So there was no Titanic. They could see a few little boats here and there, and so they stopped their engines and waited for the boats to come to them. By 8:15, they had rescued 705 people. That's all that got off the Titanic alive. They had collected all of the boats, and the rescue situation was done. They decided that they were going to go ahead and turn and go back to New York, because now they're dangerously overloaded with all this extra 700 people, and they don't have enough supplies, and they don't actually have enough fuel anymore since they had burned so much getting to the crash site. They were going to have to refuel and get more food and stuff for their own passengers before they could complete their journey. So they decided it was better to just turn around and go back to New York so they could let these people from the Titanic off and resupply and go on with their own voyage. The third ship that was involved is the Californian. The Californian was captained by a man named Stanley Lord. At about 11:20 p.m. on the evening of April the 14th, he was probably, by his reckoning, he was about 20 miles away from the Titanic. There is some evidence that he was closer than that, but by his official reckoning, he was about 20 miles away. They had seen what they believed was the Titanic. And he realized that he was running into an ice field. It was dark. And so he ordered his ship to just shut down and go to and anchor for the night. And they would just pick it up in the morning when they could see better. And he went to bed. His radio guy went to bed around that same time, which was common. There was only one radio man on the ship at that time. And they would do that if they didn't have two. If they had two, they would work in pairs. And so somebody was always on the radio. But they only had one, and you got to sleep sometime. So generally, the ones that worked as a single operator worked a 15 to 18-hour day, and then they went to sleep because you got to sleep sometime. And so this was the time that he went to sleep. And remember, this is just before the Titanic starts sending out her signals for distress signals. Around midnight, a little after midnight, the two officers that were standing watch on the deck saw white rockets start going up from the ship that they could see. And they're discussing, what do you think that means? And I don't know what that means. What do you think that means? Even though they should have known immediately that this was a distress signal. At least by the time they saw the second rocket, they should have known this was a distress signal. But apparently Captain Lord was not a friendly man, and they were a little afraid to go wake him up and tell him this. So finally they decided, okay, this is not looking good. So they went down and told him, look, dude, we're seeing these rockets. What do you think we should do? He said, was it a distress signal? And they were like, we don't know. And he asked them what color were the rockets, and they told him it was white rockets. And he said, okay, try to signal them with the lamp. They had a lantern that they could click, 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 and do Morse code. Signal them with Morse code and see who the ship is and what's the deal with them. Never suggested wake up the radio guy and have him radio and see what's going on. So they tried to send the Morse code. Nobody ever answered. The guys on the Titanic were a little busy. They probably weren't sitting there watching the ship looking for Morse code, but they said they never saw the Morse code lamps. And some of the crew did survive, and some of the crew that were involved in launching the rockets survived. And they said, we never saw any kind of a response from that ship at all. In total, so the Captain Lord went back to bed and told him, yeah, wake me up if anything big happens. So in total, the two guys on watch saw 8 distress rockets go off. And about 2:20, the ship disappeared, and they assumed that it had sailed away. We know what happened at 2:20 was the Titanic sank. The next morning at about 5 o'clock, at about a little before 5 o'clock, Captain Lord got up and said, okay, tell me what happened, during the night. They told him about seeing the 8 rockets. They told him that the ship had started to look funny, like it was tilting a little on one side. They assumed it was making some sort of a strange turn, and then it disappeared. And they assumed it had steamed away. And he asked again, are you sure it was just white rockets? And they said, yes, it was white rockets. So around 5 o'clock, a few minutes later, the radio guy gets up, gets his breakfast, signs on, and immediately starts hearing all this stuff about, my gosh, did you hear the Titanic sank? Did you hear about the Titanic? Oh my gosh, the Titanic sank. It was huge news. All of the ships were talking about it to each other. And he was like, what do you mean the Titanic sank? It's unsinkable. And they were like, no, dude, it sank. And so he gets a position because he knows he's going to tell his captain what's happened. And they tell him exactly the longitude and latitude that the Titanic had given as their last position. He takes that information and goes to the captain and says, Captain, the Titanic sank and it was right here at this place. The captain looked at the position And the testimony of the radio man and the other officers that were in the room was that he looked at the position. He said, that can't be right. You go find out what a better position is. This can't be right. And sent the radio guy back to get a better position, an official position. He came back a few minutes later, said, that's the position. That's the position everybody has is the last position. Captain Lord dithered around for a little bit and then had the Californian set sail to the position where the Titanic was, which was less than 20 miles from where they were. But he had them go around in a weird way that had them coming in from a different direction, coming in from the west. So they kind of made a circle around and came in like this, so that maybe it would look like it took them longer to get there. Nobody's really sure about this. They know that this was what was done. He said it was to avoid the ice. Maybe that's true. I don't know. He arrived at the wreck site at about 8:30. We know that by then the Carpathia had already picked up all of the survivors, and he talked with Captain Rostron. Captain Rostron said, we've picked up all of the survivors, all of the boats are accounted for. Why don't you stay and look around for a little bit and pick up any bodies that you find, any debris that you find? Why don't you do that? He agreed to do that. They went, basically, I think he must have gone like this and said, yeah, we don't see any bodies. And then they left and went back on with their cruise. When the Titanic's passengers arrived in New York on board the Carpathia, everybody on shore already knew what had happened because there had been so much radio traffic back and forth between the ships, and the Titanic had broadcast for so long, because in the end, she was able to stay afloat a little over 2 hours, almost 3 hours, before she finally sank. And most of that time, the radio officer was sending out distress calls. So other ships were picking stuff up. They were radioing their offices inland. Newspapers were getting hold of the story. People already knew what was going on. So there was a huge crowd to meet the passengers when they came off. And there was already beginning to be questions about what exactly happened. How could over 1,000 people die that quickly in a situation that wasn't a war situation? How does this happen? So people were really curious about, who's to blame here. So when they arrived, there were already being subpoenas sent out from the Senate, the US Senate, to do a fact-finding mission, basically, to find out what happened and who is to blame. In the meantime, Captain Lord's ship docked in Boston, which is in Massachusetts, which is a little further away, a little further north of New York. And his crew started saying, man, we saw this ship and we're pretty sure it was the Titanic, and we didn't go do anything about it. And that word started getting out to the newspapers as well. So Captain Lord was subpoenaed to the hearing that was going on. They talked to Captain Rostron. Captain Smith had died. Of course, he went down with his ship, but they talked to the surviving officers of the Titanic, all of whom told the story about we sent up rockets, all of this stuff. The Carpathia, they talked to their captain. He told what he had done. He told that, nobody else showed up. He was the first one that got there. Everyone praised Captain Rostron. They said, he had done the best job he could do. Yeah, he got there too late, but it wasn't because he wasn't trying his best. He was just too far away. He did everything he could do. And then they talked to Captain Stanley Lord. And apparently, from all of the reports, Captain Lord was kind of a jerk. And he didn't like being talked to about this. He didn't want to be questioned. He didn't feel like it was anybody's right to talk to him. And he was just kind of a jerk. He did not make a good impression anywhere he went. And it turned out that he told a completely different story than everybody else that had been on that ship told. And the captain keeps the captain's log. If you've watched Star Trek, you know that they talk about the captain's log. Well, The captain's log is the final official version. It's like, the final draft. But they have what they call a scratch log. That's the rough draft that all of the officers that are on board, they write down the positions, they write down the stuff that happened. And then that end of the day, the captain goes in and writes all of that stuff down in the official log. But they keep that scratch log until after the voyage is over. It's not ever destroyed because you might need to look back and make sure you got something right, or whatever. Well, they subpoenaed the scratch log and discovered that the 2 days for the 14th and 15th of April were gone. They'd been torn out of the scratch log, gone. So all of the stuff about seeing the rockets and all of that was probably in there, it's gone. And in the official captain's log, there's not one single mention anywhere about seeing the rockets and seeing any of this, seeing this other ship, nothing. So in the end, it was noted that Captain Lord had probably been the ship that was right there next to the Titanic. He'd probably been close enough to do some good. He might have been able to save all of these people. And he was his name was Mud, basically. He was never a respected captain. He kept moving down from smaller to smaller to smaller ships after that. He never got past this. Captain Rostron, on the other hand, kept moving up and up and up and up, and finally became the Commodore of the Cunard line, which is like their highest captain. He's the number one captain. Now, looking at this logically, could Captain Lord have saved all of the passengers of the Titanic? And the answer is probably no, because he was still, several miles away when all of this started happening. It would have taken, he was at anchor, which meant that it would have taken him a little while to get up some speed and get to where he was supposed to be. Even if he was only 20 miles away, it would have taken an hour to maybe 2 hours to get there, starting from a dead stop. However, he definitely could have gotten there and maybe saved at least some more of the passengers that went down on the Titanic. And so, you just have to wonder, why didn't he do anything? Because he should have known that white rockets were a distress signal. And he should have known that a distress signal at sea means that people are about to die. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about Stanley Lord? Give me your answers in the comments. I'm going to give you well, that's taking a long time. All right. Here is my email address for the Tortilla Cat files. Please give me either email me or give me a comment. Tell me what you thought about this. Tell me what you think happened. What do you think should be thought about Captain Lord? Was he a villain? Was he misunderstood? What do you think? I'll see you the next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.